Association. And the hope with the Digital Accessibility Affinity Group is to create a welcoming environment for those who are leading digital accessibility efforts at their institution to come together and really exchange insights, understandings, even challenges and things that you're navigating at your institution, or perhaps there's a best practice that you have that would support your colleagues across the state. We wanted to create a group that would allow for those conversations to naturally and organically take place, while also offering some while also the group being able to inform how MCCA can best support the efforts that you are facing at your institution regarding digital accessibility. If you are leading digital accessibility at your institution, we welcome you to join our groups. We have a schedule here of when we'll be meeting in the coming weeks. You'll see here at the very top, October 24th was the webinar that we held regarding exploring ableism in the hopes to increase accessibility for all individuals at our institutions, not just students, but faculty, staff, and other individuals that you are working with. The materials for that webinar is on our website. In a moment, I'll place a link to that in the chat. You can also view the recording as well. Today's webinar is about creating accessible content, and then the dates that you see thereafter from November through May 21st of 2024 is when the group will be convening as a collective. I'd like to highlight the March 5th meeting, as we will be joined by the Office of High Speed Internet. Michigan's Office of High Speed Internet and Access, they're going to be sharing with us Michigan resources that are available to students who may not have the technology that they need, or perhaps there's some digital literacy that a student may be navigating and working through. There are resources and supports available at the state of Michigan, and they will be sharing what is available through their office at that time. If any of that sounds interesting, which fingers crossed, it is a nice appetizer to support you, I would welcome you to join our mailing list so that you can stay in the know and subscribe. If you have access to a digital device, you can use your camera function on your digital device. If you hover your camera function over the image on the screen, you can take a picture and it will show up a link. But I am also going to be sending a link to you in an email, and I'll also post a link in the chat so that you have the ability to subscribe to our mailing list if that is of interest. With all of that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass things over to Max, who will get us started today.
This is Max. Thanks, Precious. Hi, I'm Max Hornick. I am a community education specialist for Disability Network Southwest Michigan. We serve people with disabilities in 8 counties in Southwest Michigan. I've worked for Disability Network for the last 5 years in a few different roles. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. As a brief visual description, I am a white non-binary person in my 30s with glasses and wavy red and purple hair. Helping me out today is my colleague Tyler, and I'd like to ask him to introduce himself.
Thank you, Max, and hello, everybody. My name is Tyler Urias, and I am the Community Education and Digital Liaison here at Disability Network Southwest Michigan. I've been with the agency for just 2.5 years. My pronouns are he, him, his, and as a brief visual description, I'm a white male with blonde hair, blue eyes. Very excited to be here with you all this afternoon, so thank you.
This is Max. Thanks, Tyler. Before we get started with the content, I do want to go over a few ground rules we use for accessibility for all of our virtual presentations. And those are to please say your name before you talk. Some people might not be able to read your name on the screen, or if they're joined by phone, they might not be able to see it at all. So that just helps us know who's talking. You can mute your microphone when you're not talking. That helps reduce the background noise. You are welcome to make comments or ask questions in the chat box or out loud. Please use whatever communication method works best for you. And if you, anything that you put in the chat, Tyler will read aloud so everyone can follow the conversation there, even if they're not able to access the chat. And if you do have a question that you'd prefer to ask anonymously, you could send it as a private message to Tyler, and he will not tell us your name, just ask the question. But the truth is, if you have that question, someone else probably does too. There are no bad questions anytime you're with us at Disability Network. When you are talking, if possible, if you could please have your video on and be close to the camera with nothing in front of your face. This just helps for communication for people who might need to read lips or facial expressions. So with that all being said, I'm going to get the PowerPoint up. Okay, so hopefully you are now seeing our title slide for today, accessible content. Make sure your message reaches everyone. The first slide here does have our Disability Network Southwest Michigan logo, as well as contact information for Tyler, our boss Miranda, and for myself. Our conversation doesn't have to end at 4:30 today. So if you have follow-up questions, we're here to be a resource. Please feel free to reach out and contact us.
This is Tyler. There were a few messages in the chat as well. Holly wrote, colleagues, please rename yourself and include your affiliation. You may also include your pronouns. And Precious also wrote the link to subscribe to the accessibility mailing list and another link to exploring ableism webinar recording and resources.
This is Max. Thanks so much, Tyler. Thanks, Precious. All right. So before we dive into the main content for today, I do want to start off with the definition of a disability. We do that for all our presentations because we found almost everyone has kind of their own idea of what a disability is. So when we talk about disability, we're using the broad definition from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says a person with a disability has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So those are things most people can do on a daily basis: walking, talking, reading, writing, major bodily functions like eating, sleeping, or breathing. So when we think about this definition, it's a lot broader than how most people talk about or think about disability. In order to prevent discrimination on the basis of disability, the ADA does also protect people who have a record of such impairment and people who are regarded as having such an impairment. And we mostly see that in the employment setting. So I'm not going to go super in depth with that today. But if you do have questions about that piece of it, please feel free to reach out. The image on this slide shows a group of 10 young adults in front of our Kalamazoo office building. And all of these young adults have a disability. Some people might look at that photo and say, but I don't see any disabilities. But that's because about 80% of all disabilities are what we call non-apparent disabilities. Most of the time, when a person has a disability, you're not going to be able to tell just by looking at them. So that means you may have coworkers, students, other staff who are people with disabilities that you're interacting with on a daily basis. Are there any questions for me on the definition of a disability?
This is Deb. No questions per se, but how, well, maybe I do. How, and I'm sorry, I don't have my camera on. Let me do that. It's not working. There we go. How, I guess I'm not even sure how to word my question. Is it a good idea to ask for understanding or clarification of a disability? I mean, if you don't see it right away, but then begin to notice,
This is Max. So generally, if you're noticing that maybe someone is having difficulty with something, I wouldn't necessarily ask them if they have a disability or
Right.
what their disability is, but it might be a time to say, hey, I noticed you're having a hard time with this. Is there something I can do to help? Is there a way we could do this differently? And or, depending on how obvious it has become to you that disability may be a piece of this, sharing information about, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but we have, whatever the accommodations office is called in your school,
Mhm.
that might be useful to you. So providing information and asking how you can help is probably going to be the better approach rather than the direct, do you have a disability type question. Did that help answer what you were looking for?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
This is Max. No problem, Deb. All right. So I'm going to go on and start going into the accessible content piece of things. So what is accessible content? It really means presenting information or content in a way that a person can receive or access it. Accessible format needs will vary depending on the person and the situation. We always recommend when it comes to disability, don't make assumptions. There are a lot of different disabilities that can affect how people access information, and some of them are those non-apparent disabilities. So that could include things like a learning disability, a brain injury, or a cognitive disability. Even, being hard of hearing or having low vision is not always obvious just from looking at a person. When someone's unable to read information, printed materials or electronic materials that are written, we usually say they have a print disability. So a print disability is any disability that prevents a person from gaining information from text in the standard way. And it will require them to use alternative methods of accessing that information. And so there are a number of types of disabilities that could cause that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of disabilities that might lead to that and the different ways that people might access text-based information with those disabilities. And of course, text is not the only way that we communicate. Some people might need assistance related to audio information or visual information. The image on this slide shows a person's hands reading Braille. It shows there's another image of an individual wearing headphones and using a refreshable Braille display with a laptop. There's an image of a video with captions, and then there's an image of a gentleman using a computer with the screen zoomed in extremely far to make the print and the text larger. And so what makes content accessible? Well, really the main difference between accessible and inaccessible content is any barrier to someone being able to receive that information is creating inaccessibility for people. For printed materials like brochures, flyers, newsletters, syllabus, your design, layout, and formatting choices will make a big difference in people's ability to access that. So we will be discussing some design choices you can make to help improve accessibility for those printed materials. For electronic and online content, like digital documents, emails, websites, social media posts, we will talk a lot about how to create accessibility for screen readers. Screen readers are computer software that reads digital content aloud to people with print disabilities. So, for example, people who are blind or have low vision, or people with learning disabilities like dyslexia. Not all PDF documents are created equal when it comes to screen reading software. An electronic PDF that's formatted correctly will be accessible, but a PDF that is simply a photo of a scanned image will not be, because those screen readers can read digital text, but not photos. So we'll talk more later on about how to make your photos accessible to people who use screen reading software. For audio and video content, remember to always provide an auditory means of accessing visual information and a visual means of accessing audio information. The image on the slide shows a young woman with Down syndrome sitting at a computer. Were there any questions or comments? I saw there was a chat.
This is Tyler. Yes, I did put in the chat the PowerPoint handouts. There is a link provided from Precious, and that is there in the chat, which will have all of the PowerPoint and handouts for today's presentation.
This is Max. Thanks. All right. So when it comes to accessible content benefits everyone. Who are we talking about? Could be your students, donors, board or committee members, volunteers, other faculty, other staff members, anyone. The statistics show about 1 in 5 people in the United States, so 20% of the population, has some type of disability. Some recent data shows that about 1 in 3 adults in the state of Michigan has a disability. So it's extremely likely that many of the people you're interacting with have disabilities. And remember, most disabilities are not apparent. A lot of people don't like to talk about their disability. And so if they can't access your information, they might not ask for help. They might just look elsewhere. The images on the slide show an elderly couple reviewing a binder of papers while a professional views the same information on a computer screen, a brown-skinned woman using an earpiece, and a diverse group of young professionals meeting at a conference table. So any of the people that you're interacting with, regardless of their role, their age, might be someone with a disability. Why is it important to offer accessible content? First of all, it's just good communication. You know, the more accessible your content is, the more people your message will reach. It's also an opportunity to lead by example. It demonstrates your commitment to the inclusion of people with disabilities. It also just is a great way to be prepared. If you create all of your, course content accessible at the baseline level, then it avoids you having to scramble to put together an accommodation for a last minute request from somebody who registered for the class the day of or day before it starts. It eliminates potentially awkward situations for you and for the person needing the accommodation to make those inquiries and those requests and put those things together. And it also just respects their privacy, right? It doesn't force them to disclose they have a disability in order to be able to access that material. Finally, it's the law. It is the law that when it comes to information presented for the public. And so I'm going to move on to the next slide to talk a little bit about that. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, when that act became law in 1990, modern communications technologies like the internet were still just in their infancy. They did not exist in the way that they do today. And although the ADA does not explicitly mention internet accessibility, it has been widely interpreted by the courts to also extend to internet-based content. Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA are the 2 main sections that would apply here. Title 2 prohibits discrimination on the part of state and local governments. So community colleges are entities under the jurisdiction of state and local governments. Title 3 prohibits discrimination by places of public accommodation. So if you are hosting events that are open to the public, then that also applies to you. The Department of Justice has repeatedly stated the ADA does not specifically address the question of web accessibility, but the language is still broad enough to include websites as part of your operations. So since Title II applies to your organization, then they're also going to apply to the web content put out by your organization. And the image on this slide is just icons of different digital communication technologies. So are there any questions on anything I've covered so far?
This is Tyler. In the chat, Joseph wrote, and our LMS.
And this is Max. I'm guessing that means like library media services or something like that. I'm not familiar with the the acronyms here.
This is Tyler. Yes, in the chat, Holly wrote learning management system.
This is Max. Okay, thank you. I just was not I don't work in the in the academic world, so that was not a familiar acronym for me. So thanks for clarifying. Yes, so definitely applies. Okay.
Also in the chat, Holly wrote, it is an online software system that houses online course content.
This is Max. Okay, gotcha. That helps. Now I'm on the same page as everyone. So yeah, definitely it would apply. And in addition to the ADA applying, given that every community college I'm aware of is accepting federal funding through like the federal student aid programs, you're also bound and obligated to be accessible for people with disabilities under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504 of that law says that, you know, you have to provide equal access to programs and services for people with disabilities if you receive any federal funding. So it's another place where it's part of the law too, even if it wasn't just the right thing to do. It's just part of what our current disability civil rights laws say we have to do.
This is Tyler. Also in the chat, Joseph wrote, federal funding equals follow federal laws.
This is Max. Yep. All right. So we recommend when you're thinking about how and when to ask about accommodations, to make it just part of your standard operating procedures. Include an offer for alternative formats anytime you present information. So for example, for printed or downloaded documents, just putting in the footer of that document, this document is available in an alternative format upon request. Just reminding people, hey, if you need this in, you know, large print, Braille, audio, whatever. For, you know, events or presentations you're hosting, maybe asking on the registration. So, and providing information about how to request those accommodations. So for example, to request an accommodation, contact Miranda Grunwell at email address or phone number. So just providing that information is really helpful so that people know where to go, who to ask, who to talk to. And given, you know, being community colleges, it may be, you know, to request an accommodation, contact the Office for Student Access at email address or phone number or something like that, whatever your accommodation services are called, right? And then be prepared to provide that accommodation, having a plan in place to respond to those accommodation requests. And following up on them instead of just like, oh, somebody requested this and kind of forgetting about it. When it comes to alternative formats and accommodations, some common alternative formats people might request are electronic formats, like a PDF, a Word document. They might request large print. And generally, if they don't specify, generally large print means a minimum of 18-point font. Braille, people might request Braille. This is becoming a less and less common request as the screen reading software technology has exploded in terms of availability, affordability. more and more people are opting to go with that technology rather than Braille, but you still may sometimes receive that Braille request. Or people might request text to audio. Again, this is becoming less common over time as things like screen reading software are rolled into, basic features within smartphones, basic features within common computer programs like Microsoft Word or Adobe Acrobat, but it still might be requested occasionally. Some other accommodations that might be requested is specific seating. Somebody might say, hey, I've got Crohn's disease. I need to be seated nearest the door. So if I need to run off to the bathroom, I can do that. It's a really easy accommodation to make. Somebody might say, for my PTSD, I need to have a line of sight to the doorway. Those types of seating requests are like really easy accommodations to do, and they're pretty common.
This is Tyler. There is a question in the chat from Daniel. Are there specified or recommended typefaces?
This is Max. That's a great question. And yes, there are, and we will get into that shortly. Generally, if people reach out to me asking for large print, I'll ask them, what is there a specific font and a specific size you prefer? Because some people do have a preference that is different from the majority preference. So usually I'll ask for that, but we will be getting into how font selection matters and how it can impact accessibility in just a minute here. Another request you might get is for CART or captioning. Auto captions are getting better and better all the time, but CART, which is short for Communication Access and Real-Time Translation, is a human-generated live captioning service. So this is when a person who's been trained to use transcription keyboard, which is similar to like what a court reporter would use to type out really quickly everything a person is saying in court, but for captions, for live captioning. So some people find auto captions sufficient, but some people do not. Some people really are like, no, I really need those human-generated captions. You might also get a request for an ASL, American Sign Language interpreter. Keep in mind, ASL is a second language. It is not the same language as English, just signed. It has a different grammatical structure. So if people are requesting this type of interpretation, it's important to recognize that they're asking for interpretation into their primary language. It's not just, turning English into signs. It is a different language. And so if you receive those requests, follow up with the person, find out more about what they need and how you can make that happen. And so I am now going to get into some basic guidelines for accessible content. They're going to apply to everything you do. They will apply to all formats, and really they're just basic good design and good communication. And so I'll go in depth on each of these momentarily, but the four things I want to focus on first are font selection, color contrast and usage, avoiding busy backgrounds, and using plain language. So when it comes to fonts, when we're considering what font to use for things, in general, there are two main types of fonts. Serif, such as, for example, one of the most common serifed fonts people are familiar with is Times New Roman. And then sans serif fonts, with one of the most common examples of that being Arial. And so the image on the slide shows two capital letter T's. The T on the left has serifs. These are sort of small lines emphasizing the endpoints of that letter. The T on the right is sans serif with blunt endpoints. In general, sans serif fonts are easier for most people to read. However, in long lines of printed text like a book or a report, the serifs can help people stay on the line that they're currently reading. So if you're, putting out digital content that's brief, sans serif fonts are probably going to be the way to go. If you're publishing a book, you probably want to use the serifs. Those fancy display fonts should be limited to large print like headlines or titles. Especially loopy and cursive typefaces can be really hard for some people to read. We also recommend you avoid using all caps in your communications. Camel case is usually easier for most people to read, and that is when you capitalize the first letter of each word.
This is Tyler. Also in the chat, Deborah wrote, I never knew that those terms for the fonts meant.
This is Max. Yeah. So hopefully that helped. I even put on this slide the word serif at the beginning of it in a serifed font. And then the rest of this slide is all in sans serif to help you have that quick visual of what's the difference. One of the things with all caps is also, in addition to a lot of just people read all caps as shouting, some of the screen reading software will read all caps as shouting. So like people who've got learning disabilities and they might be reading this digital document using screen reading software, it may be yelling at them if you're capitalizing things to emphasize. Avoiding putting words in all capital letters and just capitalizing those first letters of each word. I'm going to go to the next slide, which has just a nice visual example of this. There are two text boxes on this slide, and they both show the exact same information about ADA compliance assistance from our website. The left side is our bad example. It uses 3 different fonts. The title is all caps in a stencil font that's kind of hard to read. And the bulleted information is in a very loopy cursive font that is impossible to read, pretty much. The right side is our good example. It uses 2 fonts, one for the title and one for the body text. Both are clearly legible. Remember, your end goal is to communicate. Do not compromise on the readability of your content for those fun or fancy fonts. Does anyone have any other questions or comments for me about fonts?
This is Tyler. There was a question sent in the chat. I have a private question. Should emails be written in serif?
This is Max. With an email, I typically would suggest doing those in a sans serif font. They're usually not long enough that you really need those serifs to help people stay on their line as they're reading. So I would recommend using a sans serif when possible with emails. Unless somebody has specifically told you, I can't read sans serif fonts, I really need, the serif font.
This is Tyler. Thank you. And then also Holly has a hand raised.
Hi, everybody. This is Holly. I just wanted to say everything that you talked about is just really good design. I'm married to a typesetter and graphic designer, and he would agree with all of this. So good design practice as well as accessible.
This is Max. Thanks, Holly. Yeah. There are also out there some fonts that are supposed to be more accessible for people with certain types of disabilities. Some people with dyslexia, not all people with dyslexia, but some people with dyslexia find Comic Sans as a font works really well for them. The downside of Comic Sans as a font, it works worse for most other people. It's harder to read for most people without dyslexia. So I don't recommend putting stuff in Comic Sans, but it might be an accommodation request you might get from somebody with that type of disability. There's also a specific font called Dyslexie that was designed specifically to be more readable for people with dyslexia. And some of them really quite like that font. Again, it's not necessarily going to be easier to read for everyone with any type of disability out there, but for some people, they do find that to be much more readable for them. All right. So let's move on and talk a little bit about color. So when it comes to color, you really want a high contrast between the text and the background for the best readability. And the highest contrast you can achieve is black text on a white background or white text on a black background. But keep in mind, when you are using color, the contrast you see on your own computer screen can sometimes be deceiving because different monitors will often render color differently. There are some online color contrast checker tools. WebAIM.org has one. And there's at the end of this presentation, there is a list of resources, including some of these contrast checkers. Another way just to do a quick test, if you're like, I don't want to go online, I just want to check this really quick, is to print in black and white. That'll give you a pretty clear idea of what the contrast is between the text and the background. But just in general, don't necessarily trust your screen view all the time. I know I would never be able to trust my screen view for color contrast because I use a very strong blue light filter on my computer at all times for migraine prevention. And I apologize if my slides look a little bit orange as I screen share them. I can't quite tell if it does come through that way to you all or not, but it's better than me getting a migraine in the middle of the presentation and then like losing speech or something. And that would be difficult for all of us. So color contrast, yeah. Let's look at the next slide. This has some examples of this. So at the top, we have our black text on white and our white text on black. It says it doesn't get any better than this. Our second example has some yellow text on sort of a light or medium blue background. And it says this might look good here, but then we've converted it to grayscale. And it says, but not so much in grayscale. It's very difficult to read that in grayscale. And so then our third example here is another good example. It says, try using high contrast colors. And interestingly, the yellow on this is the exact same yellow as on the previous example, but with just a darker blue background. So it says, try using high contrast colors to ensure accessibility for all. So you can use color. We're not opposed to using color. We like colors. It's just making sure that the way you use them isn't obscuring the message you're trying to get across to people. Are there any questions on color contrast?
This is Tyler. I will just say I've noticed because you are using the blue blocker filter, there is this slight color differentiation on this slide that I've noticed for the first time. So if that was off, that blue would be a much more royal blue, and it would be much harder to actually see that text. But what's interesting is it's made it more readable by putting that filter on it. So that is news to me.
This is Max. That actually kind of makes sense. Yeah. So hopefully you get the gist of it. I know that my color filter might be throwing it off a bit, but hopefully you got the core idea we're trying to get across here today. So another thing about color is color coding. For some people, color coding is a great way to differentiate or highlight information. But we strongly recommend you do not use color as the only way to differentiate information. You may have noticed so far our good examples have a green check mark and our bad examples have a red X. Because we like the idea of color coding for people who can differentiate those colors. Now, the reality is red-green color deficiency is a very common disability. For people with that disability, it's sometimes called red-green color blindness. Red and green most often look like varying shades of brown to people with that particular disability. So if they were looking at our bad example on this slide that shows some different steps in a task and whether or not they were completed, while in the bad example, the completed column just has X's in different colors, that has green X's for the things that were completed and a red X for the thing that was not. For someone who has that red-green color deficiency, they're going to be like, I guess either all of these or none of these were completed. I'm not sure. Our good example, it's still using color coding for people who like that quick visual way to get the information across, but instead of having X's for both of them, it says in green, yes, and in red, no, for whether or not a task was completed. So color coding is, for some people's brains, an amazing way to convey information, but make sure it's not the only way you are conveying information to other people. Are there any questions or comments for me on color coding? Okay, let's talk a little bit about backgrounds. So we strongly encourage you to avoid busy or image backgrounds being used behind your text. The images on this slide are a couple of examples. Our bad example is on the left. It shows this Kalamazoo Outdoors fall schedule, and it has a very beautiful fall leaves background that makes the text nearly impossible to read. Our good example is on the right-hand side, and it still has some really pretty fall leaves, fall color imagery, but instead of being behind the text, it is forming a border around the text. So it's not obscuring what any of the text says as far as what the Kalamazoo Outdoors events are. So, you know, when it comes to backgrounds and images, you can use them, but make sure when you are using them, looking at the placement, that it's not obscuring the text. It's not that you can't have those pretty fonts and those pictures, but remember, the content is about communication. The pretty pictures, the pretty fonts are the icing on the cake. They're not the whole cake, right? Are there any questions for me on backgrounds? Okay, cool. I'm always afraid like somebody who really likes pretty pictures is like going to be mad. Like, that's why I'm trying to remind you, I'm not opposed to pretty things. Just don't make it impossible to read. All right, so let's talk a little bit about plain language. We strongly encourage you to use plain language in your content when writing for the general public. And the general public is usually most comfortable with a 6th to 8th grade reading level. And I know like this might be like, well, we're college professors. We're supposed to be, you know, teaching college age students, but the reality is a lot of your students are going to be coming to you with the 6th to 8th grade reading level. Almost half of adults in the US read at or below an 8th grade level. And there are some online reading level checkers you can use to check this. And we do have, again, links to some on our resource slides toward the end of the presentation. So we recommend you use short, simple sentences with familiar everyday words. We also suggest you use the active voice whenever possible. An easy way to test whether a sentence is written in the active voice or the passive voice is to add the phrase "by zombies" to the end of the sentence to see if it makes it sound like the zombies are doing the action in the sentence. So the slide has an example of the same idea expressed both in the passive voice and in the active voice. The passive sentence says, "A ball was thrown." And it would make sense if we said, "A ball was thrown by zombies." Then yes, the zombies are doing the action. The active sentence is, "Someone threw a ball." And if we add "by zombies" to the end, "someone threw a ball by zombies," the zombies are not doing the action in that sentence. And consider, does your audience know what you know? We always like to remind people to write out abbreviations or acronyms in full form the first time you use them, and to avoid technical jargon and academic or industry lingo that your audience is unfamiliar with. Now, knowing you're working in an academic setting, there are times, absolutely, especially if it's part of the content you're trying to educate people on, that you need to use those academic terms. This is not to say you can't use them. This is to say, remember to define them the first time you use them, so that people can know, can follow what you're talking about. Another format that, oh, I forgot to mention, we did include a handout on plain language tips. That's just a really nice reminder reference sheet that you can use as you're creating things. So that's in the handouts that were provided to you. So another format that you might want to consider publishing materials in addition to that plain language, is called Easy Read. And Easy Read is a format that is designed for cognitive accessibility. It really is designed to be extremely approachable for people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities. It uses very simple language, has one idea per sentence, and uses images to support understanding of concepts. I did provide some links to free image websites you could use to find icons for Easy Read content on the resource slides toward the end of this presentation. And I actually wrote this slide in Easy Read format to just provide you a visual example of what Easy Read looks like. So the image icons on this slide show an Easy Read document with an image next to each line of text, a brain in a person's head to represent words that everyone knows, an idea light bulb, and a group of people with a light bulb above their heads to represent understanding an idea. The images I used for this slide are actually in Microsoft PowerPoint. I just went to Insert Icons and found icons to represent the ideas I was talking about on this slide. And so the slide just says, Easy Read is a way to write so everyone understands. Easy Read uses words everyone knows. Easy Read includes one idea per sentence. Easy Read uses images to help people understand. So we did provide in the handouts something from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network about Easy Read. It is called A Guide to Making Easy Read Resources, if you want to learn more about this format. It is a longer document, and it's really intended to provide everything you need to start producing Easy Read content. And so I'm going to go over to the next slide before I pause for questions. This slide has a chart comparing plain language and Easy Read formats. So plain language uses a 5th to 6th grade reading level typically, whereas Easy Read uses usually a 3rd to 4th grade reading level. Plain language sentences could include more than one idea, but Easy Read uses one idea per sentence whenever possible. Plain language paragraphs can be more than one sentence, but in Easy Read, each sentence is its own paragraph. Plain language does not need to include pictures, whereas for Easy Read documents, each sentence has a picture. For plain language, the format should be clear and easy to understand. Whereas with Easy Read formatting, we use a large font, lots of blank space, and no more than 5 sentences per page. And so the source for the information on this slide is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And we do, I think I can't remember if I mentioned, we do have some options for reading grade level checkers and Easy Read images listed on the resource slides at the end of the presentation. So with that all being said, are there any questions for me on plain language or Easy Read?
This is Deb. You're doing so well, Max, that I don't think any of us have questions. You're doing a great job explaining everything.
This
I
is Max.
appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Yes, yeah, it's not a problem if there's no questions. I just want to make sure I just went over quite a bit pretty quick and wanted to make sure I didn't rush through it.
This is Tyler. Also in the chat, Don wrote agreed with Deb.
This is Max. Thanks, Don. All right. So let's talk a little bit about documents. So when creating documents, we recommend using styles as much as possible. So if you've ever been in Microsoft Word, you may notice towards the top right in the toolbar there, they usually have things that say stuff like normal, paragraph, header 1, header 2, title. These are styles. That's what we mean when we refer to styles. The benefit of these is that screen reading software will tag the styles, so it can make it easier for screen reader users to navigate through the document. You know, if it's a really long document, a lot of times there's a bunch of different sections in it. And if you don't have a print disability, it's fairly easy to just look through it, scroll through it real quick and find the section you're looking for. If you have a print disability and you're using a screen reader, do you really want to listen to it read the entire document to find that one section you're looking for? Probably not, right? So using those headings for different sections can make a person go, oh, okay, I found the section I'm looking for in that document. We recommend you format the document's layout rather than using a lot of extra spaces and returns, because the screen reader is going to read all those blank spaces. When it comes to images that you might have in a document, create alt tags or captions for all of the images. The screen reader can't, see, so to speak, the photo or the image, but it will read the alt tags and the captions. So usually if you're in a Microsoft program, if you right click on an image, there will be the option to either, add alt text, or if you click format picture, there will be something will come up that will give you the opportunity to add alt text. Alt text meaning alternative text. It's an alternative to looking at the image and seeing what it is, for that screen reader to read the description of what's in that picture. We also recommend you avoid using word art. I know this probably isn't as big of a thing nowadays. I know it was like very popular back in the 90s in Microsoft Word. You could use word art to create, rainbowy big letters and stuff. don't do this. The reason for that is it confuses screen reading software pretty frequently because it's somehow simultaneously an image and text. So we recommend that if you want like a text graphic in your document, just use an image and with an alt tag instead. And when it comes to Microsoft Office programs, they have an accessibility checker built into them. And many software programs nowadays have these accessibility checkers built in. They'll vary depending on the program and what version you're running. But the images on this slide show the Microsoft Office Word accessibility checker. So if you go to File, Info, Check for Issues, and select Check Accessibility in Microsoft Word, it will generate this accessibility report on the right-hand side. And you can then go through those accessibility inspection details. It'll tell you 1, what the problem is, 2, why it's a problem, and 3, how to fix it. So it's a pretty useful tool that's built in. And I think a lot of us are very grateful that so many more of these accessibility features are being built into the software at a baseline so that we can all use them. Does anyone have any questions for me on accessible documents before we move on to web stuff? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, there was a question in the chat. Are downloadable PDFs better than flipbooks on web pages?
This is Max. I'm not even quite sure I know what a flip book is on a web page. Can you give me an example of what that is? I'm just not sure what a flip book is on a website, unless.
That was me that answered the question. We have a tool that we use on our website for certain things. That's like a book that you can like flip the pages, but it's like an animated page turn. But we were wondering today if a downloadable PDF is more accessible.
This is Max. I don't know. I would say if the PDF is created in an accessible manner, it's probably going to be accessible to more people, but I don't know enough about the flipbook software to say one way or another, really. So I'm sorry, that was not a helpful answer at all. But that's about all I can say when it's a format I'm not terribly familiar with.
Also in the chat, wrote back, all good, thank you.
This is Max. No problem. All right. So let's talk a little bit about websites. When we're looking at accessibility for online content, a lot of it is going to be about screen readers. Make sure you're providing alt tags for all of your images. So that means providing descriptions of the images for screen readers to read. Usually if you don't enter alt text, it'll just read off the file name. And usually the file name is not useful information at all, because if it's a photo, half the time it's like a string of numbers .jpeg, and that's not helpful. But providing a description of what is the key information this image is providing that a sighted person is getting out of looking at this image that relates to the content. It doesn't necessarily mean every single tiny piece of information and detail about the image, right? It means what is the key information that you are meant to get out of this image. You can empty and null alt tags when the image is not important to the content. So for example, I've seen like some people create PowerPoints where they had little tiny images at the corners of all of the slides to make it look like it was a photo album. Those are not important to the content. they're just, if you were, going to provide alt text for each of those, it would just be annoying and distracting to the person using the screen reader to navigate through the PowerPoint, right? So you can, in PowerPoint, for example, there's actually, when you go to write the alt text, a checkbox you can check that says, like, this is not, or to ignore this image for image in terms of screen reading software. Basically tells the screen reader to ignore that image because it's not relevant. Make sure that all of your navigation is accessible, right? So using reputable brands of software and templates or themes for your site. And then for drop-down navigation menus, offering landing pages as an alternative. So oftentimes when you go to a website, if you hover your mouse over a button on the website, it'll show a drop-down menu of different pages under that category. For somebody who's using screen reading software, that's not really accessible, right? They may not even be navigating using their mouse. They may be navigating using their keyboard exclusively. So having it so that you can just click that button and it takes you to a page that then has the list of other pages under that category, and it takes you to that landing page, can be really helpful for people. When it comes to downloadable documents, offering alternative formats for those documents that can be downloaded from your site, like, having the plain language version or the easy read version or the large print version of a document. And then don't forget the basics that we discussed earlier, the font size, the way you use color, the way you use backgrounds, and the way you use plain language are still all going to apply to content on the web. We did provide in the supplemental materials a handout called Tips for Accessible Web Content that you can reference to help you make sure your web content is accessible. When it comes to alt text, do not depend on artificial intelligence to generate your alt text. The image on this slide is a tweet from Salamander Jill that reads, "Highly recommend looking at the alt text Google assigns to your photos." And it's above a photo of a person holding a turtle with alt text that reads, "A person holding a chocolate-covered donut." So artificial intelligence can be a very useful tool, but you need, if you are using artificial intelligence for a first draft of your image descriptions, your alt text, you still need, as a human being, to double check it because it is not perfect. A blind person encountering this photo on the internet thinking that it has a chocolate-covered donut is going to be having a very different experience from a sighted person encountering this photo and knowing that this is a turtle, right? So very important we're not there yet. We cannot rely on the AI for this particular purpose yet. Are there any questions for me on web content before we move on to talk about social media a little bit? Okay, hearing none, I will take us to talk about social media. So when it comes to posting a photo on social media, we encourage you to include an image description in the text of the post. Again, you only need to include description of what is pertinent to the message, not necessarily every single little detail of the photo. On Facebook, you can alt tag photos now, but if you're scheduling posts in advance, sometimes it's difficult to get the alt tags to work with that. So oftentimes it's a better practice to include that description in the body of the text of the post. On the left-hand side of the slide, we have our bad example of a Facebook post. There's a photo of a man fixing a bicycle, but the post just says it's bicycle maintenance day. On the right side, we have our good example. The post has a photo, and the text of the post includes an image description that reads, photo of tall raised bed in horseshoe shape. Now, depending on what you're doing, the alt text capabilities for social media have improved. I have a personal like business page that I run that I don't necessarily always put text, the image description in the text of the post now. It depends what I'm doing, because it depends on a few different factors. I typically will put captions for photos that are providing information that may be relevant for a sighted person looking at it who maybe has a reading disability. And then the alt text will have information that will be relevant for a person with a vision disability, maybe someone who's blind or has low vision. And I'm going to go on to the next slide because I think this helps with clarifying why you might use image descriptions in the body of the post versus in the alt text. I strongly encourage, if there is text in the image itself, that you include that in the post text, the image description within the body of the post. Because the screen reader will read the text of the post, but not text that's in an image. So this is what I'm talking about, where I would put, if I was like trying to decide which stuff goes in the body of the post in the image description there and which stuff goes in the alt text, if I know that there's text in the image, I want to make sure that gets in the text of the body text of the post, but then maybe other visual things that, you know, sighted people don't need provided to them goes in the alt text. So the images on the slide on the left-hand side is our bad example. The post says, "Can I get an amen?" If you can't read the image, which says, "Eat local, shake the hand that feeds you," Michael Pollan, you're like, can I get an amen for what? I have no idea what I'm saying amen to. Maybe, or maybe I disagree with what they're asking me to say amen to. On the right-hand side, we have a mostly good example. The post reads, "Epic game day deals all around our store, like local pork ribs from Lawton, just $6.99 per pound, and just arrived for Super Bowl 49. And so the text of the post includes all of the text that's in the image, but it's not labeled as an image description. So if you have a print disability, you might not be sure if you are or are not missing some of the information that's in that post from the image. Does anyone have any questions for me about accessible social media content?
This is Tyler. If I may just add something too, just real quick, and if somebody's got a question, I'll definitely hush. But I just wanted to share from an experience that I had in doing early on when I first started doing some of the Facebook postings for our agency. I was kind of the mindset, well, if it's in both places, then I'm good to go. If one's not working, it's somewhere else. That was very, very quickly told me, please stop doing that, because what's happening is it's actually reading it in both places. So you don't want to overcompensate and say, I'm just going to put it everywhere, because then it's going to get there. You just got to choose one or the other, but certainly not both, because it will overread that.
And this is Max. And that was why I mentioned, so I know, for example, I've mentioned, and Miranda is very open about this, Miranda uses screen reading software because she has a learning disability. Now, because she can see images, she has set up her screen reading software to not read image alt text to her. Whereas most people who are blind or have low vision, their screen reading software is going to be set up to be reading image alt text. So that's why, knowing that probably a lot of people with learning disabilities are like, I don't need it to read the image description to me, and they've turned off the alt text feature, right? When I'm posting, photos of like peppers for sale, I'm putting the names of the peppers in the caption, but then the alt text I'm describing, these are long, red, pointy hot peppers for somebody who's blind and would not be able to see the visual aspect of the peppers. So that's just one example I use. So I'm using pieces of both to make sure people who are accessing information in multiple different ways are still getting all of the pieces, but not doing that repetition like Tyler talked about, where it's, I just got this image description twice from my screen reader and it's deeply annoying. So yeah, thanks, Tyler. I appreciate that.
This is Tyler. No problem. And one of the other things I had to kind of temper too when I was doing it is if the post is really thick with content and it's already going to be a larger character use post, I then will tend to use the alt just because I don't want to over expand that body of the post even more. And so it is kind of a dance, but also in the chat, Daniel did write, will the readers recognize tags like this one? And the example was hashtag SBXLIX.
This is Max. So that is, when it comes to using hashtags, screen readers have been improving. We recommend usually if you choose to use hashtags, to put them in camel case. So capitalizing the first letter of each word in the hashtag. I hate the Super Bowl hashtags because none of us think in Roman numerals. Like, when I wrote my version of describing the image on this, I did not read it as SBXLIX because none of us think in Roman numerals. We use a different set of numerals. And so I'm not a fan of that one. Like I think if you're a big fan of football and the Super Bowl, you'll recognize what that is. But for people who are not, they might be like, what is that? So that's one piece. Do you have any other comments on hashtags, Tyler?
Well, I will say that some from what I've experienced too is that all screen readers are not created equal. I've heard that several times. And so it could be that you have a really good one that will, and that doesn't mean that another one will. But I will say that Facebook is actually being a little more cognizant about employing some accessibility features right within it. And so are some other social media sites. And so right now you can actually enable an accessibility screen reader right within your page. So anybody viewing that page would have a little play button that they could play within each post, and it's an embedded text reader. So I have found that one will actually pick up the hashtags. I can't speak for like JAWS or the other ones, but
this is Max. Thanks, Tyler. All right, cool. So let's go on and talk a little bit about presentations, and this would apply to classes too, probably. Because probably a lot of you are using, things like slides as part of your courses, but not necessarily everyone. When it comes to presentations, we recommend you use template formats. So using those styles again, headings, body, etc. Also, again, avoiding added spaces and returns so that the screen reader is not reading all those extra blank spaces. We also recommend you use a unique title for each slide. The reason for that, again, if you think about how someone who's using screen reading software might be navigating the presentation, they're trying to find the right slide. And if 5 different slides all have the exact same title, it's going to be harder for them to find what they're looking for. So you could insert subtle differences like more about or such and such topic continued. You could also number the slides if you want, but you don't have to. We don't. And then use, again, alt tags for photos so that screen readers will see them, will describe what is in that image as you have written it. And again, don't forget those basics we talked about at the beginning. They all apply: fonts, color, backgrounds, plain language. When it comes to online presentations, we did provide a handout that is tips for online meetings, and it's sort of arranged as a checklist of responsibilities for the facilitator and for the participants. For the facilitator, we recommend asking for accommodation requests before the presentation, providing a way for somebody to simply reach out and say, hey, I need X, Y, or Z for this presentation. Reading chat box comments out loud to the group. Some people might not be able to read the chat. For people who use screen reading software, a lot of them will not use it with the chat because it gets very overwhelming. Anytime something new pops up in the chat, it starts reading the new message. So maybe they missed 5 different messages because it just kept skipping to the next one. So if you read chat box comments out loud to the group, then everyone can follow, and it's a lot easier. And also, just speaking as someone who sometimes talking can be hard for me, sometimes I put stuff in the chat box, and if people don't read it out loud, I'm not sure if anyone ever noticed it or acknowledged it, and it feels weird and kind of bad. So it's also just beneficial, I think, for people who do prefer to communicate that way, to know that the way they've communicated was recognized. Describing any graphics or visual content on the screen so that people have equal access to that visually presented information. Enabling those Zoom caption settings before scheduling your Zoom events. And for whatever platform you use, just making sure that you've set it up such that people can use the captions. Both the facilitator and participant should be responsible for identifying yourself before you talk, for having your video on when you're talking, whenever possible, and for muting your microphone when you're not talking. Are there any questions or comments for me on presentations? Okay, let's talk a little bit about videos. So always caption your videos for people who can't access audio. This might be due to a disability. This might be due to, like, I don't have headphones on me and I'm on the bus or something, I see people all the time watching audio who, as far as I know, have no hearing disability, or watching videos who, as far as I know, have no hearing disability, but they're just like in a public location watching video content on their phone and don't need all the other people around them to hear it. So captions are really important for people with and without disabilities nowadays. Also, beware of auto captioning. Again, the technology is imperfect. The errors can be problematic. There's nothing wrong with using auto captions as the first draft of your captions, right? But then have you as a human being, or whoever, have a human being go over it and check it and make sure the captions are correct. And when captioning, add labels to identify who's speaking. If there's more than one person talking in your video, this can really help people follow what's going on. Use audio descriptions. So audio descriptions are when you are providing an audible description of the visual content that's on the screen. This doesn't necessarily have to be every single visual thing that shows up on screen, but if there is key information that's being provided through visual means only, you'll want to have that audio description in there. These could be included directly in the video from the beginning, or they could be added in as a secondary audio track to describe the visual content on the screen. And then for videos, think about providing ASL interpretation. A video of ASL interpretation can be added in, but as a picture-in-picture, but you'll want to think ahead when you're creating the video for the placement to make sure that picture-in-picture isn't overlapping key pieces of the video. And so I'm going to go to the next slide to show some examples of this. So on this slide, we have two good video examples, and they both have arrows pointing to 3 important elements for accessibility. One, they have labeled who is speaking in the captions. So one of the video screenshots shows a caption that says, "Sarah, I've had some really good experiences." 2 audio descriptions are both spoken and they're included in the captions. I've seen sometimes films that will have, audio description, but if you're viewing them with captions on, sometimes people will be a little bit confused because they're like, there's sound that's not in the captions. Why isn't it in the captions? Am I missing something? I'm not sure. Right. So just including it in the captions can make it so nobody's confused about whether they're missing pieces of the content or anything. And then 3, they've added an ASL interpreter video as a picture-in-picture in both of these examples. In one of them, she's in the top right corner, in the other, she's in the top left. When possible, I also strongly encourage including a transcript. For some people, transcripts are more accessible than watching a video. I'm a person who I'm like, I will not listen to a podcast, but I have read a podcast transcript multiple times. So transcripts can be helpful for people who, whether because of, things like ADHD can't make themselves sit and watch that video, but for some reason text works better for their brains, or things like for maybe somebody who's deafblind. They're like, well, the video is really not accessible to me through either means, but I have my refreshable Braille display that I can read the transcript and know all of the information that was provided in that video. Does anyone have any questions for me on accessible videos? Okay. And for your comic relief, again, a reminder that auto captioning is not perfect. The image on this slide is a BBC News graphic, and it shows captions from the BBC News that say, "Welcome to the Year of the Whores. People around the globe celebrate." We know the BBC did not intend to announce the Chinese New Year as Year of the Whores, but that is how the auto captions interpreted it, unfortunately. So again, there's nothing wrong with using the artificial intelligence to produce your first draft of your captions for that pre-recorded video, but have a human being double check and make the corrections where they're needed so you don't end up like the BBC here. So in these last few minutes, we did provide a number of different resources, a color contrast checker at WebAIM, a few different readability and grade level tools. I really like the Hemingway editor. It's really, it works for my brain because it does actually color code things that it's suggesting changes to, and it helps me quite a bit. There are a couple of different sites that have free icons for creating easy read images. And then there are some different resources in terms of web content accessibility. Rooted in Rights Access That is a really helpful resource if you're like trying to be like, okay, how do I do, the alt text again? Remind me how to do that. They have a bunch of different really great resources on that. In terms of using styles, we talked about in documents, there is an article, a link to an article on how to use styles. That is a really good one. And then we have some social media resources. So World Institute on Disability Guide to Social Media Accessibility. There was a really great Accessible Social Media 2.0 webinar that's free, archived there online. And then a blog post from Great Lakes ADA Center on social media for people with disabilities. So in these last few minutes, we've got a little bit of time for questions and comments. This last slide has our logo and contact info again. The last handout we provided is something we didn't talk about in depth today, but it is on creating accessible PDFs. And that's from Adobe, and it's a really good resource. Adobe has a number of quite good resources on their website in terms of PDF accessibility. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see faces and see what questions or comments people have in our last few minutes here. And Tyler did put our contact info in the chat, as well as our Facebook page, our upcoming events, and a link to our Paving the Way series, which is for families of children with disabilities. Thanks so much for having us. Any last questions or comments? Holly.
Hi, everybody. This is Holly, and I just wanted to thank Tyler and Max for the time today and sharing your expertise with us. I also wanted to, on behalf of Precious, the MCCA, the Digital Accessibility Affinity Group, thank all of you for joining us today. I am going to reshare the link to the accessibility mailing list in the chat. If you would like to join that listserv and mailing list, we would really appreciate it. We have some new faces that are with us today, and we hope that you will all join the affinity group so that we can continue the conversation in that location. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I would be happy to pass those along to Precious as well. And I will include my email list in the chat.
This is Max. Thanks so much, Holly.
This is Tyler. Yes, thank you all. And in the chat, there are some other messages as well. Deborah wrote, thank you all very much. This has been an interesting and helpful. I need to go, but I appreciate the excellent information. Dawn wrote, great session. Thank you. And Holly did provide her email address. And Carla also wrote, thank you. This was great.
This is Max. Thank you all so much. I won't make people stick around until 4:30, but I will stay on until everyone's gone, just in case there's any last minute questions. Thanks so much.